We're going to go ahead and get going now. Hopefully everybody has found their way into the meeting. I think there's still a couple folks that are coming, trickling in, but hopefully they'll forgive us for starting mostly on time. We're grateful for the opportunity to share some of this information with the communities that we serve here in California. We've invested as a company. Pacific Corp has invested about $500 million over the past 500 years in wildfire mitigation, and we have another $1 billion that we're planning to invest over the next 3 years. That's across our 6-state service area, but that is a significant investment, and wildfire mitigation is one of our key and top priorities. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Alan Barrett. He is our Vice President of Transmission and Distribution Operations. He's going to walk you through some of our wildfire mitigation efforts. Alan, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate this opportunity just to go through Pacific Power's wildfire mitigation plan and kind of provide you an overview of that investment that Simon just talked about, what that looks like, and hopefully you'll also just learn a little bit about what you can do as well to be prepared for this year's wildfire season. So here's the agenda, and we're going to start off by reviewing the company's plan development and journey that we've been on. And then we're going to dive into the plan itself, touching on the key elements that you see there on the screen, such as just an overview of the foundation that makes up the wildfire mitigation plan, the areas of the service territory that have heightened risk of wildfire, the situational awareness that we use to stay on top of that risk and identify it, which then results in the strategic programs and the system hardening that we are implementing. Then we'll touch on public safety power shutoffs, that program and the protocols around that. And then we'll finish on community outreach and education. So we actually don't have much time today in an hour, and there's a lot that's inside a wildfire mitigation plan. So I'll be speaking at a high level. So I would encourage you to go review the plan itself, which is available on our website, to get into the details even more. So with that, let's get into it. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So let's look at the journey, right? So you see the top half of the slide there since 2018 to today, how every year we've been publishing a wildfire mitigation plan. It's been evolving, it's been expanding, and every year we've been filing a wildfire mitigation plan in California. Now, the lower half of the screen is showing the fundamental elements that make up that wildfire mitigation plan. And so it really starts with situational awareness. And this is where we do an analysis to determine where is the area of high or heightened fire risk across our service territory that we serve, right? And we do that situational awareness and that risk modeling in 2 ways. The first way is we take a long-term risk modeling approach. And this is where we go back 30 years and we pull historical weather and fire data, and we use that information along with the geography and topology of an area and population and structures and what type of fuel types are in that area. We take all of that information to forecast where in the service territory are the areas that if a wildfire ignition was to occur, for any reason, lightning caused, utility related, for whatever reason, if a fire was to ignite in that area, it would have the most impact. It would be a catastrophic location to have a fire, meaning the attributes of that location and the weather allows for a fire to spread rapidly, and it's hard to access, so it's hard to put out. We want to identify those areas that have that greatest impact so that they can inform our decision making. But that's a long term where we're using 30 years of data and we're trying to forecast out using the long-term view where those high risk areas are. And that does inform our programs, and I'll talk more about that. But to complement that long-term view, we have a short-term risk modeling. And this is more of our dynamic seasonal risk. And so this is where we look at the annual outlook for the year and go, well, maybe it was a drier winter than normal. Maybe it was wetter. Maybe the summer is going to be more drought impactful. And so this is where we look out and create a daily risk forecast that looks out 5 days, and we do that every day of the year. And we say, what's the weather right now? Where is the risk right now, the next couple of days? What's going on? And this might indicate areas of risk or areas where we need to take action that the 30-year kind of view wouldn't pick up because it's using 30 years of data. Therefore, even if you weight it or whatever, that it might take longer for certain areas to pop. But the shorter term risk modeling allows areas to come to the top of the modeling quicker so that we can take action and deploy the appropriate mitigation, right? So through that situational awareness, which involves weather stations and risk modeling, and we'll talk more about that as we go through this presentation. But that all helps identify where the risk is. So then the second guiding principle or foundational element of the wildfire mitigation plan is this middle bucket called operational practices. And that's where, using the risk modeling, we say, all right, what should we deploy to mitigate that risk of fire? And this includes a bunch of activity that surrounds how we operate the system. So think of this as, what type of tools do we take out on a job? What type of work do we do? Do we do the work hot or de-energized? How do we restore outages during these times? Do we do a full patrol, or would we patrol at night? What type of protective settings are we using? Are we putting the system in a more sensitive mode so that any little disturbance, the line will de-energize very quickly so that we can go get eyes on it, see what the disturbance is, make sure everything's good, and then re-energize the system. And so we can control how sensitive the system is to disturbances. It can lead up to, proactive de-energization, like a public safety power shutoff, where the conditions are so extreme that it's safer to de-energize the system, let the conditions pass, and then re-energize the system, right? Those operational practices can also include our inspections and our vegetation management program. It also covers if there's an active wildfire nearby, say a lightning-caused wildfire that's just moving towards the electrical system, we can de-energize to make it safer for first responders to get into the area and to make sure that the electrical system isn't making the situation worse by staying energized. So those types of programs all go under that umbrella of operational practices. And that's just all about how we're operating the system under elevated conditions, okay? Then the third component of the wildfire mitigation plan, shown over on the right, is the system hardening. And this is in those areas where we have identified the highest risk that if a fire ignition was to occur, it could become catastrophic. When the potential is to that level, we look at rebuilding or hardening our system to make sure that we're not contributing to the risk in that area. And so this can involve us rebuilding the lines, say our overhead lines. You think of that bare conductor that's going from pole to pole, and we replace that bare conductor with a covered conductor, basically has an insulation over it, so that if anything interferes with that wire, it doesn't create a fault, it doesn't create a spark, it just reduces that potential for a wildfire ignition. So you think of a tree branch falling into the line, instead of hitting metal, it hits that insulation, there's no spark, that tree branch continues to fall to the ground. And so that is under the banner of system hardening. Undergrounding can be part of system hardening, and addition of new devices like relays and reclosers that help open up and sectionalize the line if there's faults, helps do that quicker. Those new pieces of equipment under system hardening as well. And so between those three, going through them all is that category shown at the bottom, which is just engagement, where as we develop the wildfire mitigation plan and as we do these operational practices and as we identify the risk and as we look to harden, we really have to make sure that we are coordinated with the communities, with our public safety partners, that we're conducting outreach, and that we're on the same page as those that we need to work with to pull this off effectively. So just an engagement runs throughout the wildfire mitigation plan. Let's go to the next slide. So let's look at some of the statistics for the Northern California service territory that we serve. So in California, Pacific Power provides electricity to approximately 45,000 customers, and that's through 62 substations, 3,100 miles of distribution lines, and about 730 miles of transmission lines that cross nearly 11,000 square miles of service territory. So that service territory that you see in blue on the map there on the slide, across that whole service territory, that's where we deploy the system-wide initiatives of our plan, such as our weather station deployment and our situational awareness, our risk modeling, our modified operational practices that I talked about, the community education and outreach. That's across the entire service territory. And to give you a sense of the construction activity that occurred in that area for Pacific Power in 2023, we replaced 96 miles of that bare conductor I was talking about with insulated covered conductor. We replaced 5 miles of bare conductor with underground, and we installed 36 relays, reclosers, and circuit breakers. Also, we installed nearly 4,300 non-expulsion fuses, and that's a different type of fuse than what is standard for the electrical system. This type of fuse, when it operates, contains all of the elements of that fuse inside, making sure that there is no material, no spark that falls to the ground when that fuse that's protecting the electrical system has any potential for igniting a wildfire. So that gives you a sense some of the construction activity that occurred last year in this area. Now let's go to the next slide and take a look at where have we identified the areas of high risk, high wildfire risk in this area, right? So Pacific Power has implemented modeling tools to support the location-specific risk identification that informs the wildfire mitigation programs. And so with the development and deployment of these modeling tools, we've identified the geographic areas of the heightened fire risk across our service territory. So on the map that you see on the slide, you see the high fire risk area, or HFRA, and this is shown in purple. And you also see the high fire threat districts, HFTDs, and that is the area that's designated by the state of California. That's the risk map that was created by the state. And that's shown in green and orange. And it's really the combination of these two areas, whether it was identified by the state risk identification mapping process, or whether through our own risk analysis that complements that and adds to it. The combination of those is the identification of the risk areas in this service territory. So as you can see by the numbers there, over half of Pacific Power's service territory is in an area of heightened fire risk. It's in these areas that Pacific Power deploys its enhanced vegetation management, its increased frequency of asset inspections. This is where that system hardening investment takes place, all to mitigate that wildfire, but prioritized in the areas where a potential wildfire would be the most impactful. And this analysis is what helps us do that. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this situational awareness and how that's used, how that's deployed, right? So that slide we were just looking at was that longer term approach of taking that 30 years worth of data that helps us identify those areas. This slide is now pulling out some of the short term risk modeling I talked about earlier. It's this dynamic risk assessment that through the situational awareness and the weather forecasting that can be done anywhere across our service territory and in near real time. So our approach to situational awareness includes the collection of a lot of data from either the utility-owned weather stations or other data sources that we have available to us to forecast and assess the risk and inform that decision-making for the current day, for the next 5 days. So it's really more that real-time decision-making. All this data is coming into play. So in terms of Pacific Power's weather station network, we've installed 98 weather stations in this California service territory that collects and provides data to our meteorologists and the risk modeling. And that data is coming in from those weather stations every 10 minutes. And so it's getting that wind speed and all that weather information, all that condition information that's feeding the model that supports our operational decision making. And while we have 98 weather stations installed to date, we're continuing to build out that weather station network as we move forward. It's really about fine-tuning those details, determining where the gaps in the weather collection might be, and putting those weather stations that just continues to refine all that data and all that modeling that's coming back to us. So to help us evaluate all this data that's now coming back in, we've hired 6 full-time meteorologists who provide that daily event-driven forecasting that informs all the decision-making that we make on a daily basis. It also helps inform any decision-making that we're going on as it relates to a public safety power shutoff decision-making, right? It's all this information coming in that helps inform those decisions. We also have plans to install 8 advanced wildfire detection camera systems with artificial intelligence that can detect smoke and alert first responders quickly. So while now weather stations are helping us forecast out the elevated fire risk conditions, now the cameras kind of play out in if an ignition was to occur, whether utility related or just lightning caused or something else in the area, it just increases the speed of the response, which is also very important in limiting how impactful a wildfire will be to a community, right? We don't want it to grow and spread quickly. So the faster we can get first responders into that area, the better off we'll be. I should also note that this weather data that we collect is made available to the public, and it's on our situational website. If you go to pacificpowerweather.com, you can see all these weather stations. You can see their current readings and whether or not the current wind speeds, are in the 90th percentile, 95th percentile of the winds that that location has seen. So that is available to anybody to go and see. All right, let's go to the next slide and let's look at, so I've just walked you through how we model the risk across our service territory, how we stay on top of that risk on a daily basis. We have all that information coming into us. And so this slide is depicting that as that fire risk increases, as that information's coming back to us, and we can see the fire risk going from low, elevated, significant, extreme fire risk as it's getting windier and drier, right? The potential for an impactful, a catastrophic wildfire just grows exponential. And how far, when you get over on the far right in that extreme fire risk, that the potential for catastrophic wildfire, is just that extreme, that's in the realm of public safety power shutoff. That's where, to reduce that risk, it would be safer to reduce the risk the most is to de-energize the system, let those conditions pass, and then re-energize. But before we get there, as we're elevating and escalating through those conditions, our mitigation escalates right alongside the escalation of the conditions. So we can turn on the more sensitive settings as we get into elevated fire risk. And in some of those really high risk areas, we can turn them on even in low fire risk because the potential for catastrophic is higher in those areas. We want to make sure we have a really good safety buffer between the conditions we're trying to forecast and the current conditions on the ground. We are forecasting weather, so we want to leave room for a safety buffer to make sure our mitigation is deployed ahead of any conditions. So we go into this, what we call the enhanced safety settings, where we operate the system with a more sensitive protection setting. And what that means is that say there's any type of interference with the line. If I go back to that example of a branch that's just falling into the line on its way to the ground because it fell out of a tree, or the wind blew it from a tree into the line and it's falling to the ground, and it kind of slaps on the line. Well, these settings detect that fault and they open very quickly. We're talking tenths of a second. opens up, and that's to limit the amount of energy that's going into that tree branch, that's going into that fault. Because if we can limit that energy by opening the line, de-energizing that line very quickly, the potential for an ignition drops significantly, right? So these protection settings, we turn on as the conditions elevate. Now, with that, as we go into those more sensitive settings, that does mean the outages that customers would see, whereas normally might be a momentary, as in the system opens up, the branch continues to fall to the ground, the branch isn't there anymore, the system closes back in, re-energizes, the power was off just for like 5 seconds. Well, now those outages are longer because the system stays open, stays de-energized until we get a resource out there, patrol the lines, make sure all is good, and then we re-energize. We really want to make sure that risk of a wildfire ignition is not present. So that does mean more frequent outages and can take a longer duration outage. And so it's this balance of when do we deploy that risk mitigation due to the fire risk versus the reliability and the customer impact of more outages and longer outages. And so that consideration and that decision making is all in the process as the conditions escalate. Our deployment of those settings escalate as well. And if the conditions come down, those settings then go back to normal. And so that's how that process for the enhanced safety settings work. Also, as the conditions escalate, other activity is going on as far as when we get into the elevated fire risk, where we are evaluating what work is going on, or maybe we'll do the additional inspections and vegetation inspections ahead of those conditions, or we'll look at maybe canceling certain types of work. So that as well is all going on as those conditions escalate throughout the year. And I also want to note we do it every day of the year. So even if it's in February and all of a sudden we get some really windy day and it's been dry for a little while, that all of a sudden you have just a couple days that went into an elevated fire risk, we are running that risk model every day of the year and deploying the mitigation appropriately that might correspond to that level of risk. So no matter what type of year. And we've really seen that recently across the country, right? When you think of the wildfires that we're seeing in Maui or in Texas or in Colorado over the last couple of years that happened during times of the year or areas that you weren't considering as a fire risk area. And so our approach is every day of the year running the risk modeling and across our entire service territory. All right, let's go to the next slide. So now let's transition and look at some of the programs that once those areas have been identified, let's talk a little bit more about the programs in those areas of high risk, all right? So in terms of our asset management programs, we perform more frequent inspections in these areas, which generally translates to inspections being performed about twice as often inside the areas of that high fire risk compared to outside of the fire risk. And that's to identify and correct anything on the assets that should be resolved, right, with on a more frequent basis. And so we do the inspections and the corrections more often in the areas of high risk. We also perform annual infrared inspections on the overhead transmission lines, and that's to supplement our normal inspection programs of the transmission line, right? This is where we use a helicopter, you use an infrared camera. It's able to detect pieces of the transmission line that might be hotter than others, that show us that there could be a failing piece of equipment. It allows us to replace it before it actually fails. And so that allows us to detect using that additional technology as well. Now, regarding vegetation management, we're regularly reviewing best practices and exchanging information with other utilities. And that kind of goes beyond vegetation management as well, but in all areas of wildfire mitigation, where we work with other utilities to get a sense of what's the latest technology, what's the latest practices, what should we be considering expanding or deploying as part of our mitigation program as well. Vegetation management, though, also includes additional inspections in these areas. And annual pole clearing of equipment poles, where if a pole has a fuse or a transformer at that location, at the base of the pole, we'll clear an area about a 10-foot radius around the base of that pole, so that if any of that equipment was to fail for any reason, and if any kind of sparks or anything fell to the ground, uh, the fuel reduction at the base of the pole has been removed so that there's nothing there to ignite, right? And so we do that on equipment poles. And just to give you a sense of the volume we're talking about, we inspected thousands of miles in 2023 through these various programs, and we've cleared over 3,000 poles at the base of those poles, just to give you a feel for the volume that we're talking about. Now, we're going to be continuing this effort in 2024. So this is an annual effort that we're looking to continue. So don't be surprised if you see the inspectors and the line workers and the vegetation crews working in your communities and your neighborhoods, all in an effort to help mitigate and reduce this risk of wildfire. Let's go to the next slide and talk about system hardening, right? So in addition to the programs I just talked about as far as inspections and veg management, now let's talk a little bit more about the system hardening, which is prioritized in these areas of highest risk, right? These are multi-year, high investment projects. This is rebuilding the lines from that bare conductor to the covered conductor, undergrounding, replacing relays, reclosers. These take a number of years for each of the project, between the engineering and the permitting and the actual construction. So since it takes a number of years, we want to make sure we're prioritizing to the areas that would be impacted the most by wildfire, right? If an ignition was to occur. And so we look at those areas and we prioritize system hardening. And so in terms of the overhead lines I was talking about, Pacific Power plans to rebuild over 250 miles here in the next just couple of years in this territory we've been looking at. And so as part of that program, when we look at those lines to be mitigated, those overhead lines, we can move them, potentially just reroute them to along a road, less risky road, or less risk than the path that might be up and over, into a forested area. We'll move the line down to a road, or we will rebuild the line to that covered conductor material that I was talking about. Or the part of that scoping of that mitigation would include, where does it make sense to go underground? And that decision between covered conductor and underground. Now, undergrounding can cost, 3 to 5 times more than covered conductor. And so when we try to get the number of miles done and the dollars that it takes to invest and how quickly can we move, we're again trying to balance those considerations, right? And we find about 10-15% of the time when we're looking at these miles, undergrounding makes sense, where the cost, just based on where it's at, compared to covered conductor, undergrounding makes a lot of sense. It's comes close to the economics of covered conductor, and so we deploy it as well. So it's part of that program when we look at a line mile to rebuild or to mitigate. But right now, most of the miles planned that I've been talking about, they are targeted for covered conductor, but we'll evaluate as we look at them for whether or not undergrounding makes sense. As far as progress, and when we look back to 2022 and what we did last year, most of our construction activity was focused in Mount Shasta, Scott Bar, Happy Camp, Weed, Dunsmuir, and these areas where we successfully completed 163 miles of rebuild. In 2024, we're continuing to implement the system hardening program with a lot of activity planned. And overall, our objective is to complete an additional 100 miles by the end of this year. All right, now let's shift gears a little bit as we go to the next slide. And now we're going to talk about public safety power shutoff. All right. And so Pacific Power facilitates collaborative sessions with its public safety partners year-round via workshops and outreach events designed to prepare everybody for what a public safety power shutoff or a PSPS would look like, right? It takes a lot of coordination, because de-energizing and removing the power from a community, right, has impacts in the community, and we recognize that. And we want everybody to be on the same page about what that would look like if a de-energization, if a public safety power shutoff was required. And so we tend to do this outreach. It's front-loaded in the year to make sure those conversations are happening before we get into fire season, right? And that everyone's prepared for the upcoming fire season. And so this can include regional workshops and tabletop exercises just to enhance the broader coordination and collaboration. We're coordinating with public safety partners and other community organizations, and we attend conferences with them, town halls. And that also includes participation in some multi-day functional exercises where we sit down and actually practice walking through an event of how would it go and what do we find. And this helps us identify critical infrastructure in a community when it comes down to, well, if there is no power, how does that impact critical services, your communication? How does it impact firefighting, irrigation, the water system? Where are the pumps? Do they have backup generation? What about critical facilities in a community like hospitals? Do they have a backup generator? How could we minimize that impact? And so that's by going, community, county to county, and making sure we're having these conversations, and so that we can help identify this information, these critical infrastructure ahead of time, because if there's any steps we can take well in advance of an event, that event will be that much more, coordinated if and when we get there, right? So at the core of our decision making when it comes to the public safety power shutoff program, it's just balancing the risk of the conditions surrounding a potential event with the risk created by the de-energization itself. And so this is addressed through communicating with our partners and our customers before and throughout the public safety power shutoff event. And this can also, we also coordinate with our public safety partners to activate community resource centers, or CRCs. So this is, if we do have to de-energize, it's these shelters that can provide critical services to the customers in that area and the communities, such as on-site medical support, air conditioning, refrigeration, internet, charging stations. So making sure that there's no power at customers' homes, there's a place to go to that these services can be provided. And we have a history of being able to deploy these community resource centers. And so we have done that in 2021, where we activated for a public safety power shutoff, and in Dunsmuir, and additionally as a response just last year in 2023 to the Smith River Complex fire, where we had that emergency de-energization due to an encroachment of an active wildfire on a transmission line, where we activated 2 CRCs for the customers in those areas. Also critical to a public safety power shutoff program is the notification, right? Where if we're forecasting those conditions coming up, notifying people ahead of time if that's possible. Now, it is weather. Sometimes it's not possible. The weather shows up quickly. We weren't forecasting it, and we still have to react. But if we have time, it's about informing people well in advance so that everybody can take action and prepare for the de-energization. And so we perform individual outreach to customers ahead of time through outbound calling, emails, text, and an additional, if it's a customer with a medical need, we perform an additional notification that's a personal individual phone call to those individuals and making sure we've made contact with them and see if they need any assistance. And if we're not able to get through to them on the phone, we will make sure a physical visit occurs and that somebody has touched base with that customer or gone to that customer's home to make sure that they're okay or if they need anything. And we do that by collaborating with public safety partners in that area, right? Who can have that resource to show up and provide that assistance as well. But to ensure that those additional notifications can be performed, we do ask the customers, to the extent that they feel comfortable in doing so, that they self-identify and enroll in our medical program, that they give us a call, make sure that they're noted in our system so that they get that additional notification. Also new in 2023 is a public safety partner portal. And so we recognize that as we get into an event, there's a need to share, detailed geographic information of the areas that are impacted by a PSPS. And so this provides our public safety partners, think of like emergency services and like communication companies, to be able to log onto this portal, see the boundary of the area that's impacted, see if they have any critical infrastructure in that area, so that they as well can start making preparations for backup generation, or I think to just keep that critical infrastructure in service. And so this allows us to exchange information in a very coordinated way to keep everyone on the same page if we got into a PSPS event. All right, let's go to the next slide and talk about here's what you can do to be prepared for emergencies, kind of in general, what you can do to be prepared for wildfire season, and what you can do to reduce the impact of wildfire at your location, right? And the first thing that we would ask is that customers just update and verify your contact information with us, right? And so you can do that by calling us at the number there shown on the slide. You can visit the pacificpower.net website and contact us there, and you can learn more information about wildfire safety and steps you can do. But updating your contact information is important, right? Because that's how we're going to leverage the public safety power shutoff notifications. We're going to use that contact information to notify our customers in advance, 48 hours, 24 hours leading up to an event, the actual de-energization, when we're restoring and when we're finished restoring. And so we want to make sure we have the up-to-date contact information for our customers so that they can stay informed during a public safety power shutoff event. The second thing you see there on the slide is just what customers can do at your home, right? And that's creating that defensible space. So when you think wildfire, it's about looking around your property, creating the right boundaries of making sure the fuel types that are there, that there's a distance between that vegetation, that fuel that is going to catch fire, and your house, right? And so these barriers, these defensive distances between the vegetation in your house and clearing it and making sure that's appropriate is a step that everyone can do at their location. And then the third one you see there is always a good reminder, just to making sure that you have an emergency plan, that you have emergency supplies, so that whether it was for wildfire, public safety power shutoff, or whether it's for a winter storm, that you are prepared for a longer outage, if you will, that whether it's some type of weather event that's preventing the power from being on. So just having a good emergency plan for your home is critical for any type of an emergency. All right, let's go to the next slide and look at some of the programs that we offer to help lessen the impact to customers that these public safety power shutoffs or time without power, it can create. And so what are some of the programs we have in place, right? And so Pacific Power offers 2 backup power programs to customers that you can take advantage of. The first is a free portable battery program, which includes a technical assessment, training, and an actual battery, and to qualified residential customers. And to be eligible, you must be enrolled in the medical baseline program with Pacific Power and in California's alternate rates for energy, or the CARE program. So if you're in those programs, then you qualify for this portable battery backup program. And if you think you are interested in that, or if you might qualify, you can call that number that you see on the slide, or you can visit the webpage for more information. But that's for customers that have some medical equipment, that they can use that battery that allows that medical equipment to obviously still function, even if the normal power supply is de-energized. The second one is Pacific Power also offers a backup power rebate program to all residential California customers. And this is a flat rebate to customers that for a qualified generator and backup battery purchase up for a rebate of $300. with an additional rebate of $500 offered for customers enrolled in that CARE program or medical baseline program I talked about earlier. And so again, you can go to the webpage to learn more about the details of that program. And so those are just two programs that you can take advantage of that help lessen the impact as we talk about the wildfire mitigation that is balancing the risk reduction of wildfire and the increased either outages, either due to the sensitive settings or to a public safety power shutoff, that the conditions are that extreme that we just had to de-energize until the conditions passed. These programs help lessen the impact to some of our more vulnerable customers. All right, let's go to the last slide here, which is just to touch on the different aspects of our community outreach and education. So in addition to the investment and the protocols and the customer programs that I've just been talking about on those other slides, Pacific Power takes a multi-pronged approach throughout the year to ensure that wildfire preparedness and educate our customers and communities is always at the forefront. And we facilitate the sessions I talked about earlier, like tabletop exercises with our public safety partners and community-based organizations where we work with them to prepare for potential events, public safety power shutoffs, or other emergencies. But we also work to get key information out into the communities we serve, and we use like social media, radio campaigns, brochures, and flyers to help get the message out about what is the wildfire mitigation program. What does it look like? We also host webinars like the one we're having today to help get the message out about what to expect. Also, throughout the year, we maintain the additional information on our website. That's always a good resource to go to get the latest information. And you see the links and the website addresses there on the screen, where you can always go visit, get the wildfire mitigation plan, and just get all the things that you can do to help be prepared for the fire season every year, throughout the year. So with that takes us to the end of the actual presentation. And so now I believe, Simon, we're going into a Q&A phase if there's any questions. So thank you very much.